Here's a question for all of us. What are we really like when no one's watching? Okay, when we're all alone, what do we do? How are we? Are we really different than when we're out and around people? That's a good question, and that's what we're talking about today on Workout Wednesday. Have you ever seen someone who acts like this? Maybe they're a Christian, say they're a Christian, they go to church, and whenever they're out and about around church people, they talk really godly, they seem really concerned, they seem really caring when it comes to Christian things, when it comes to things about God. It seems like they really have a heart for those kinds of things. They dress a certain way, they act a certain way, they speak a certain way when they're in church and when they're around other Christians. But then, when they're not around those people, when they're not at church, when they're, say, with a different group of people, a group of people who maybe aren't Christians, are unbelievers, or maybe they're just with a few people, they act completely different. Have you seen that before? They act as if God means nothing to them, Christian life means nothing to them, and they just seem like their personality has completely switched, and they are just a different person. Now, I'm sure we all have seen someone who acts like that. We say that that person has a double life. Why? Because when they're with one group of people, they act one way, they have one life. But then with a different group of people, it's like they have a second life or a double life. And folks, we know that's not a good thing. That's not a genuine type of personality to have, to where it switches from one to the other depending on who we are with, okay? When we see that, we know that person is not trying to please God. We know that person is not aiming to please God. What they're doing is aiming to please people. And God says we should not be man pleasers. We should not be people pleasers. In everything we do, we ought to be pleasing God. He should be the one that we're focusing on in everything that we do. Let's talk about this verse. There's a passage in Psalm chapter 101. It's a psalm written by King David. And he talks about walking around his house with a perfect heart. Okay? It's very interesting that he says it in that way. He'll walk around his house with a perfect heart. Why is that important? Well, think about it. When you're at home, when you're walking around inside your house, most likely no one can see you. You're alone, okay? When you're walking on the street, when you're walking at church, when you're at work, tons of people can see you. But when you're at home, no one can really see you. What David is trying to say is this: I want to have the right attitude. I want to be obeying God. I want everything in my life to be pleasing to God, even when no one else is watching me. We call that integrity. My question for you is this: are you a person of integrity? Meaning, however you may be in front of people, whether it's good, it's obedient, you'll act the same way even when no one is watching. Why? Because you're not living the Christian life. You're not living an obedient life so that other people can see you and praise you. You're doing it because you want to please God and Him alone. That is integrity. And so I'm going to leave you with a couple of points that we should think on when it comes to integrity. Number one, think about God when you're watching things on TV or on your cell phone, okay? What does God think? Is this thing you're watching, is this thing you're meditating on, this thing you're looking at, is it pleasing to God, okay? We might have our phones, we might have our TVs in our home, and no one else can see what we're watching. But guess what? God's eyes are everywhere. He can see what we're doing. He can see, okay, what's on our TV screens, what's on our cell phones. Ask yourself, is this acceptable to God? Here's a second one. Is God pleased with what you think about? It's a good question, okay? When you think on things, when you meditate on things, when you allow things to dwell inside your mind, it's very important that you have regard to what God thinks, okay? We don't want to meditate on things. We don't want to think on things that are worldly, that are nasty, that are immoral. We don't want to do that. We want our thought life to be pleasing to God, even though, yes, no one can see our thoughts, but God can. And that is a good indication of where our heart is. If our thoughts are not correct, then our obedience, our attitude, our lifestyle, it's not going to be good. So think on that. Is God pleased with what I think about? And thirdly, is what you do acceptable to God, even when no one is watching? What you do, okay, where you go, okay? God knows the places that you go, even if you are alone. God knows the things that you work on. God knows, okay, what you buy, okay? God knows what you eat or drink. He knows all of that stuff, okay? He knows whether you have an addiction to something or not. God knows, okay? And we have to ask ourselves, is what we do acceptable to God? Don't regard just what other people are thinking, because then when no one is watching, you'll do whatever you want. Always be thinking, is what I'm doing acceptable to God? That's our Workout Wednesday for today. Thank you.